Hello, fellow communication scholars. My name is Melinda Zosh. I sell BMWs for a living in upstate New York. And I also, in my free time, like to go to the movies. Recently, I saw a movie called Selma, which was about Martin Luther King's march into Selma, Alabama. And this movie really opened up my eyes to the civil rights movement. More specifically, I really started thinking more about equality. And from a woman's point of view, I work in a male-dominated industry selling cars. So I really decided to do more research on equality from a woman's point of view. Also, politics has always been an interest of mine, and in the United States, we've had 44 male presidents. However, 2 women have stood out from all the rest of the contenders who have run for office, Hillary Clinton and former Alaskan Governor Sarah Palin. Both did a great job running for office. History still holds its place for the first woman president, however, and I am looking forward to the day when that might happen. Many communication theories have been developed to explain equality and differences and why some women are assigned to certain roles such as caregiving and housekeeping, and why men take on more business-oriented roles and things like that. Many theories have been widely debated, as we all know. One of them in particular that I would like to talk to you about today is called Feminist standpoint theory. This is an idea that emerged in the 1970s by a woman named Dorothy Smith, who was a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley. She did a lot of research on the topic of equality, specifically dealing with women. This has several main points. One of them is knowledge. Specifically, feminist standpoint theory looks at knowledge from the point of view of women and girls. This idea is heavily based in Marxist ideas. As we know, Karl Marx was a German thinker of his time, and in 1848 he wrote a work called the Communist Manifesto, which I'll talk a little bit about that later. My question also is, how about knowledge and its relation to the Bible? This is one thing that feminist standpoint theory does not look at. It doesn't really go into the topic of worldviews. Men and women were all created in God's image. Therefore, can feminism and God's word coincide? I'm going to talk about this later. Maybe biological differences can also explain the difference between men and women, and why men go into certain roles and women take on other roles in life. The first key component that I'd like to talk about is knowledge. Specifically, knowledge comes from social situations, according to feminist standpoint theorists. They say that marginalized groups, including women, see life from a unique perspective. What does this mean? It means that they can see life from their own point of view, and they can also see it from the point of view of the dominant class, which in this case it would be men. Also, feminist standpoint theory says that there are distinct power struggles between men and women. These are differences that arise perhaps in a business setting if a woman is a CEO and a man is also at the same level as her, and what kind of power struggles arise from these differences. Also, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what is feminist standpoint theory and how did it emerge. It came out of the 1970s women's liberation movement, which is also called second wave feminism. Again, in this theory, knowledge is key. Knowledge from the point of view of girls and women. Marginalized groups see things differently. They see the world from a different lens than the dominant class. Also, feminist standpoint theorists argue that research needs to be done, in particular about power struggles between men and women. Its basis does come from epistemology, which is how people claim to know what they know. It comes back to knowledge. People of different backgrounds always have different experiences. So if you grew up on one side of town, then your other counterparts who grew up on a different side of town with more privileged schools and access to education, your point of view is going to be different, whether you're a girl or a boy. Also, Christianity does play a big component in my own mind because knowledge comes from the Bible for men and women alike. Proverbs 1:17 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." So this point of view can be applied to everyone. Also, there is an ongoing debate about knowledge. Some may argue that it's certain, it never changes. Other theorists argue that knowledge is always changing, it's always evolving over time and based on different experiences. Also, feminist standpoint theory looks at activities that are considered feminine in nature. This would include household work and caregiving. It argues that women tend to go into these fields because that's where their knowledge is socially situated. One sociologist in particular, Deborah Tannen, did a lot of work on communication differences between men and women. She said that experience starts young, so she's looking at the point of view of a girl versus a boy. She says that a brother and sister can grow up in the same household, but they have different worlds, and she calls these genderless. She says that boys tend to play in bigger groups, and girls tend to play in smaller, intimate ones, in a group of 2 or 3 girls. She calls these differences communications rituals. And she also conducted an experiment to show the difference in communication style between boys and girls. In the first experience, a group of boys talked about how high they hit a baseball into the air. The first boy said, "I hit it this high." The second boy said, "Oh, I hit it much higher. Mine went all the way to the sky." The third boy said, "My baseball went all the way to heaven." And the third boy said, "My baseball went all the way to God." And this does sound funny because it's a comparison of how the boys talked about how high their baseball went. But it also shows that the boys tried to one-up each other, according to Deborah Tannen. Also, she did an experiment looking at 2 little girls and how they communicated. The first little girl said, "My mom wears already contacts." The second little girl said, "Oh my gosh, my mom and dad wear already contacts." So it's funny that they use the same syntax or word choice, and Tannen argues that this is because they both tried to be the same as each other. And this translates then into adult language and how women like to talk in a close, intimate way, and men may talk more competitively. Also, I'd like to talk about the historical category of feminist standpoint theory a little bit more. It does come out of the social movements of the 1970s. However, even before this happened, some scholars are arguing that it came out of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Some women were not allowed to participate, or they weren't treated equally when they participated in some social movements. This also goes back to the 19th century with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was not allowed to participate in certain abolitionist meetings, so then she started forming her own groups with women to fight for equality. Also, this theory does focus on oppression and to raise awareness of oppression in different groups. Social standings and hierarchies are important in feminist standpoint theory. They argue that men are the dominant class. Also, Sandra Harding said some interesting words. She was one of the founders of this theory. She said, quote, "Only through such struggles can we see beneath experience created by unjust social order." So again, it goes back to oppression and seeing men as a dominant category and women as a lower category. What do we already know about feminist standpoint theory? We do know that its focus is on gender. This comes back to gender roles, gender norms, and gender traits. Gender roles are duties for men and women, such as the combat exclusion policy, which was lifted in 2013, and this did not give women the right to fight on the front lines. This has since been lifted. Also, behaviors that are assigned to men and women, such as athletic versus modest, quiet for a woman versus strong for a man. And also, it's been heavily debated in recent years. The Bible does say all men are created equally, men and women. And I would like to end on this point. James 3:13 says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in meekness." So again, everything comes back to free will. We're all created differently, and we were created in God's image to do good works for him. Thank you so much.